since Chattanooga has a lot of new blood coming into town and a lot of folks that would gain an interest in history by reading about the people, connecting the names they see around town to their story and who they were rather than kind of a list of dates. It was just a different approach, and it gave me a chance to tell a little bit about the story of who they were. Well, Benjamin Franklin Thomas is a great story. It's a very interesting story. In 1898, he enlisted and went to Cuba in the Spanish-American War. And while he was there, he encountered a bottled drink. And I think the name of it would be pronounced Piña Frío. It was a pineapple drink. Probably meant, cold pineapple. He was impressed with that. And so when he came back, he talked to friends about this. And at this time, Coca-Cola was kind of on the ascendancy in Atlanta. Coca-Cola was invented by John Pemberton, who was a doctor there in 1886. He patented it, and then Asa Candler bought it from him and just started to grow it year by year all over Atlanta, mainly through fountain drinks, because that was a popular place for a lot of people, especially young folks. Thomas and a friend of his started thinking they might go to Atlanta and see if they could meet Mr. Candler. They took the train to Atlanta in July 1899 and met with Mr. Candler. And according to some of the things I've read, it seems like they probably went a couple of times. And their idea to him was, we would like to bottle your drink and get it sold around the country. Candler was a tough nut to crack. He was skeptical about the possibility of this becoming a reality, really for two reasons. He was worried about the quality of the product. Bottling was there were still problems with bottling and keeping things fresh in bottles. Of course, this was a carbonated drink. And he was also worried about these two men. They were, I believe he was in his 30s. Yeah, that makes sense. He was in his 30s by then. He wasn't totally convinced these men had the ability to pull it off, and he didn't want a failure on the part of his company. At any rate, he relented, and he gave Thomas and Whitehead exclusive rights to bottle and sell Coca-Cola in the U.S. Actually, there was a couple of states they couldn't, but basically they got the entire United States to do it. They signed the contract, allegedly for $1, supposedly which Mr. Candler never collected. That's the legend. And evidently, they were so broke they had to wire home for money just to get the train back the last time. So when they came back to Chattanooga, this was July, they had to enlist Mr. Lupton to help them to get a little more money so they could buy the equipment, the tables, the washing gear, and all that sort of stuff. And so in 3 months, they had set up a facility and began bottling it and distributing it. And within a year, they were just cooking. They determined between themselves what they'd do is they would become parent bottlers. And they would divide the United States into territories. So this would be a franchise system. And so as a parent bottler, he would, sell a franchise to somebody in South Pittsburgh, Tennessee, Dayton, Ohio, wherever. People were just knocking at his door to get this. And then, he'd get some profits from those operations. But the killer was, he and the other two had exclusive rights to get the syrup from Atlanta. So not only they got the syrup, and then they sold the syrup to the bottlers. So that was pretty much his story, and it's a golden story of American entrepreneurship. Adolph Oachs was the son of Jewish immigrants. They were Bavarian. He went to work at 11, when he was 11, for a newspaper. He continued off and on working as long as he was going to school. He worked in a drugstore, he worked in a grocery store. He loved going back to the newspapers, though. He was a printer's devil, and the printer's devil is the guy that cleans up around the shop, he does the ink, he kind of does the dirty work. Often it's a kid. But one person described him as a human interrogation point. That is, he asked questions all the time. He loved to learn. He loved to learn how to do things. there was a chance to buy the Chattanooga Times. Chattanooga Times was also a struggling newspaper with all kinds of debt. In 1878, I think it was July 1878, he bought that paper, and I believe the cost of the paper was $800. It was $1,500 in debt. I think he had like 2 or 3% capital. He had just a little bit of money. And the story goes, according to his granddaughter, he went to the bank to ask for a loan for $300 to secure his interest in the paper, the Chattanooga Times. And the banker said, who have you got to co-sign for it? You know, and you're a minor. And he looked at the banker and he said, you. And the banker evidently went along with it and signed it. And actually his dad had to come down from Knoxville to help him sign the final papers. So in 1878 he took it over, but he was very social. He loved people. He was very energetic and obviously really focused. So he took the paper over in 1878, and within 2 years he had gotten the subscription up. Debt was way down. He was able to pay it off by the 80s and own it. So it was, I mean, he already had most of the interest, but he made a huge success of it. In the late 90s, he got word from a friend in New York, a lawyer, who said the New York Times was a newspaper that was having major financial difficulty. And this might be an opportunity for him to jump into into New York and to have control or interest in a major daily. So he went to New York and met with a group of people that were trying to buy the newspaper to save it. The newspaper evidently was printing 20,000 copies a day and only selling 8,000 or 9,000. They were losing $1,000 a day. They were running against a lot of yellow journalism, newspapers that would sell for a penny or two, or they had to sell theirs for $3. It was a losing cause. Oachs, from what I've read, was really wanting to do this, but was really uncertain whether he was the man. I think he felt probably, like he was a small town fella and going into the big time. He met with some of the principals. They were interested in him, but he'd had very little money to put up front, and essentially called on his contacts, people he'd made. It's not who you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know, including President Grover Cleveland, to sign letters of recommendation or, backing to see if he could borrow enough money to purchase an interest in the paper, a controlling interest. That's what he wanted. He wanted ownership and he wanted control. And he did it. And it was just in a few years, he upped circulation and began to bring down the debt and just show his organizational superiority. I mean, this obviously was something that he was very gifted with. I do know that it didn't take too many years for him to turn the New York Times around and to make it a very respected newspaper and a very profitable one. And I mean, he did things like, I think in his 60th birthday, he started like a pension fund for his employees. He was very geared toward his employees doing well and the paper doing well and the paper trying to do good. And sounds a little corny today, but he evidently elevated the quality of the writing and what was being presented to the public. He had a public vision. Bessie Smith was born in Chattanooga. Her older brother had joined a minstrel show. He took her with him, or she volunteered she tried out for the show. She was accepted as a dancer again, not as a singer, and began traveling with the show. A blues singer named Ma Rainey, who kind of really she was older than her and kind of precedes her as a woman singer of the blues, was on the show, and she gradually became really well known, and Bessie kind of was schooled by her. Bessie eventually kind of superseded her in terms of popularity. But she traveled with the show. She did a lot of shows in Atlanta at the 81 Theater. There was a kind of the early version of the Chitlin circuit. So she played with in a lot of what they call colored houses. This is kind of before the era of the race records, and just garnered a great following. She had a big voice. She's got that kind of bigger, kind of husky style of singing, as was typical of the teens and the 20s. She never cut a record until she was 30 years old. So in a way, you know, her young, wild, golden voice is never captured on record. Nevertheless, as soon as she released her first records, I mean, they were wildly popular, selling in the tens of thousands, some over 100,000. And she became very wealthy. And by this time, she had moved from Atlanta to Philadelphia. She died on a road trip to, when she was in Mississippi. Janis Joplin was kind of the person that made her story famous. She died essentially because she couldn't get medical help. Her funeral, when it was held in Philadelphia, was attended by estimates from 10 to 20,000 people. I mean, that's how, you know, wildly popular and how she connected with people. That indicates her great popularity. One thing about Bessie Smith in Chattanooga that interests me is everybody knows the name Bessie Smith. I would venture that 90, maybe 95% of the people in Chattanooga probably couldn't name one or two of her songs. I don't think many people have, you know, have probably ever really heard it, other than, you know, you hear a little clip on it. So for what that's worth, I just think that's an interesting legacy. Well, I just like people to be able to look at the book and, you know, find interest in these stories and inspiration from the people that lived here. Worked hard and done well, and they've given back to folks here, and I think it's, you know, enriched the community a lot and brought a good feeling to all.